Hello and welcome to American cinema. We are now at the dystopian era. Now, this is a frame that I've given it. You won't find this in any other film history classes. I just noticed that a lot of the films in the late 90s started to get a little dystopian, started to explore what the future might be like. And we see that in The Matrix, Fight Club, but we also see a commentary on society at the time threaded through all these films. And ultimately, that's what any dystopian theme movie is. It's a commentary on the times. It's sort of pushing the times to extreme so that we may see it more clearly. And we see that with American Beauty and with Truman Show, two of the films that are featured this week. They're really commenting on the society and how perfect it seems, but if you just look a little deeper, go into the shadows a bit, it's actually quite dark, and there's problems which the films comment on. And a lot of this is fueled by the pending millennial change, the year 2000. Every time in human history that you have a huge changeover like that, there's always a certain amount of paranoia. But for this one, there was a lot. And it was aided by something called Y2K, which was this big fear that was circulated amongst the population that there was going to be problems with computers. And there were minor problems. It was a legitimate issue, but millions, maybe even billions of dollars were spent to fix something that turned out to be not much. But the paranoia was there, and the films reflect that. There was a tension about the coming millennium. Even though the economy was doing well, you're in the second half of the Clinton presidency. There's scandals, there's issues, the Bosnian War, which eerily mirrors the events of Wag the Dog, which is a movie released at the same time. But in general, the economy's doing really well. This is a great era for the working class, the 90s. People did well, bought homes. There was some optimism in the air with the coming new millennium. But the young generation, the Gen Xers, were also they came to be known as the slacker generation. They weren't fitting in. They weren't making money and being as aggressive and being as ambitious as the yuppies were. So, as a result, what we see is that shows up in the aesthetics of the music. This is the era of grunge. This is the emergence of hip hop. And it's a lot of anti establishment, anti authority, anti even sometimes success music that's coming out. And of course, we have the independent film era, which continues through the 90s. As we move into the later 90s, as we've seen before in the class, what we see is that burst of independent, very free thinking, experimental films gives way to those directors being hired by Hollywood and making films on higher budgets, some of which are fantastic, which we're featuring here today. But others start to become more like the blockbusters and start to have some of the pitfalls of a typical Hollywood film. And this is a pattern we'll see repeated throughout the class. So in Hollywood, technology is emerging. We see some of the first really good CGI with Terminator 2. Famously, Forrest Gump uses it very successfully. Digital cameras are showing up, and their quality is really good. Consumers now own them, and we start to see them show up in films. We saw that with Sex, Lies, and Videotape. We're going to see it again with American Beauty and also Truman Show. So, technology in general is taking off, getting more sophisticated, and I think that contributes in a way to the anxiety of the time. People are realizing that the world is changing, becoming more media driven. They have no idea maybe what's coming, but maybe they sense it. So, interesting times, and that's why I framed it as a dystopian era. Of course, many other types of films were made. Not all the films made in this era were dystopian. Many great Hollywood blockbusters were made, like Titanic, which was huge, enormous sales, one of the highest grossing films of all time, enormous Oscar haul. We also see the Disney Renaissance during this time. Disney had kind of fallen a little bit during the 80s, and during the 90s they really regained that into the 2000s with lots of successful films. Disaster movies, perhaps tying into the Y2K and the end of the world type feelings that people were having, are very popular this time, including, of course, Titanic. And also, we see the Oscar race really heat up. This time in Hollywood, as we saw with The Player last week, the conglomerates have really taken over. Hollywood has become a big business, and it always has been. But now, under the new corporate ownership, trying to make beautiful films isn't as important as trying to make a lot of money. And of course, uh, using CGI and making blockbusters, that stuff is starting to gain momentum. And Matrix, one of the films we feature, of course, has fantastic use of CGI and other in-camera techniques. Lastly, we see the emergence of a lot of great international cinema during this time. Life is Beautiful, um, Train Spotting, other great films coming over to America and really making a splash. And that wasn't so much the case in the 80s or even the early 90s. And now, in the late 90s and into the 2000s, we see the emergence of great international cinema. All right, so let's get to the films. Few things to talk about this week, which I featured in your study guide. So all these films have some things in common. Before we discuss the individual films, they express a lot of unease felt by people at the turn of the millennium. They're rejecting or even mocking traditional values, particularly office work. All four of the protagonists of the film I've chosen have office jobs that they hate, that they either leave, get fired from, walk away from at some point in the movie. That's a major theme throughout films of the late 90s. It's that slacker generation, that Gen X, rejecting the values of the yuppies in the 80s and earn and go to work. And remember, office work had become the work. Manufacturing and a lot of blue collar work had been eliminated in America by this time overseas. We see this thread throughout all these films, rejecting these ideas, not accepting the principles of work and the American work ethic, and sort of really being into the media and hanging out with friends, which we see reflected in the films last week. So moving on, let's see. We have use of and commentary on media technology. So all these films are about media. Truman Show, very obviously. We see it in American uh, Beauty, but also in Fight Club, it's a commentary on how media has affected us. And the entire film is really about Gen X and how they're affected by the times in which they live, the slackerdom and the sort of rejection. There's a huge speech by Brad Pitt about how Gen X is the lost generation, which many people consider it to be. So anyway, on to the films. Okay, American Beauty, huge Oscar winner, beautiful film. More popular, more populist, was seen by a lot of people, unlike some of the other films. Huge images about America, and I picked this one because it ties to some of our other films that related to the family and coming of age. So it has a teenager coming of age in high school, as we saw in Rebel Without a Cause and The Graduate. Truman Show, great commentary on surveillance society, really ahead of its time. Um, really has a lot more to say about today's society, maybe, than even the time. It's a satire, and it's also sort of aping that ideal American family. Fight Club, very edgy film, very masculine film, really comments on masculinity, the sort of muted masculinity of the 80s that express, or excuse me, the 90s that expresses itself through actual fight clubs, which, by the way, some fight clubs, real ones, sprung up around the country. It didn't last long. In response to this film is really considered to have tapped the zeitgeist. It's edgy, it's dark, and it really had something to say to people. Even though it wasn't hugely successful, its influence and the thoughts and the papers and the commentary that it generated were huge after the day. And then lastly, The Matrix, probably the film you've most likely to have seen, spawned a franchise. It's really the precursor to what we see with superheroes. I mean, Neo is a superhero of sorts, and it's got all the things we've talked about. You got a superhero messiah type figure. You also see the digital paranoia of the coming age. Guns and kung fu from China. Remember that, I probably don't remember, but Hong Kong returned to Chinese ownership in 1996-97. And so a lot of martial artists and actors and so forth came from Hong Kong over to Hollywood, and we see that influence in this film. Very edgy, and of course, The Matrix has spawned, as we get into the 2000s and the birth of conspiracies, The Matrix itself has spawned a lot of conspiracies still to this day. People theorizing it, discussing the sequels, discussing all the meanings, all the subtleties, all the Easter eggs, so on and so forth. And really, I'm glad I mentioned that Easter eggs. This period is kind of, it's not the beginning of it. Kubrick was doing it in his films for decades, but we start to see lots more Easter eggs in films. Directors taking the time to put little things in the background Why? Well, for one, people are now watching on VHS and also DVDs. That's another major technology that emerged at this time. DVDs. Hollywood is making huge revenue. First in the theater, then renting and selling you DVDs and VHS. VHS now is on the fade out with DVDs. But people can now rewind and rewatch so they can pick up on details that they would have missed before. They have a different relationship to movies. They aren't just seeing it once in a theater. They have the ability to own it. Therefore, they have the ability to review it multiple times. So we see lots of Easter eggs and little things dropped into films like Fight Club and The Matrix. Okay, hope you enjoyed that summary. Don't forget to read your study guide. Lots of great information. I echoed a lot of stuff that's in there. Reach out with any questions and have a great week.